Hey guys, today we're doing Chapter 4, Section 3, which is on sines, cosines, and tangents. So, what we did today was the in-class activity, what we're going to do tomorrow. I'm not sure when you're watching this video. So, the in-class activity basically is in your book, and it's right at the beginning of Section 3. If you want to do this beforehand, you're welcome to. But what you should have gathered from the in-class activity is that what we can do is we can rotate the image of the point 1, 0 around the circle, and that's going to give us, we can use that rotation image to find, sines, cosines, and tangents. So, if we think about it, we can figure out that on the unit circle, which is a circle with the center at the origin and a radius of 1, remember the origin is 0, 0, what we can find out is that when you rotate that point around the circle, the new point that you get is actually in the form cosine theta, comma, sine theta. So let me just give you an example here. So let's say this is my unit circle, which means this is the point 1, 0, this is the point 0, 1, this is the point negative 1, 0, and this is the point 0, negative 1. So my unit circle. Now what I'm doing is, this is my origin, 0, 0. I'm taking this side here and I'm rotating it a certain amount of degrees. So let's say I rotate it 45 degrees. Well, this new point that I get here, to figure out the actual coordinate point, what I can do is I can take the cosine of theta, comma, the sine of theta. So that means that that's true for all of the points on the unit circle, okay, including these 4 points here. Okay? So knowing that, I can effectively always find a coordinate if I'm given a measure of rotation. Okay? Another thing that's important from this lesson that hopefully you found out is that the tangent of theta is the slope of that line, which is also considered the sine over the cosine. Remember that slope is the change in y over the change in x. Well, if the change in y is your sine and the change in x is your cosine, then the tangent, of course, would be sine over cosine. So, knowing this information, we can use this information to complete these tables here. Okay, so if I'm given this theta, and notice that my theta is in radians, okay, we're going to be using radians for pretty much the whole chapter. If I'm given a radian measure of pi over 2, well, pi over 2, remember that pi is 180 degrees, so pi over 2 would be 90 degrees. Okay, which means pi is 180, okay, which means 3 pi over 2, that would be like, I have 3 of my pi over 2's, okay, so that'd be right here, which is 270, okay, and then 2 pi, that's all the way around the circle, so that'd be 360 degrees. So, if I want to find the cosine of pi over 2, or my 90-degree angle, well, I can just think about this coordinate point here. This was 0, 1, right? So, the cosine of that would correspond to the x value, which in this case would be 0. Whereas the sine would correspond to the y value, which in this case would be 1. And then the tangent, which would correspond to the slope, well, the slope is y over x, or sine over cosine, so it would be 1 divided by 0, which is, of course, undefined, because we can't divide by 0. Now, if I was going to do the same thing for 180 degrees, well, 180 degrees is right here, and this coordinate point is negative 1, 0. So, my cosine corresponds to my x value, which would be negative 1. My sine corresponds to my y value, which would be 0. And my tangent is the sine over the cosine, so 0 over negative 1, which would just be 0. Now for 270 degrees, or 3 pi over 2, that's going to be this down here. This coordinate point is 0, negative 1. So my cosine corresponds to my x-coordinate, which is 0. My sine corresponds to my y-coordinate, which is -1. And my tangent is sine over cosine. So -1 divided by 0 is going to be undefined because I can't divide by 0. Okay, my last one, 360, which is just back to where I started. So this point here is 1, 0. Okay, my cosine of 360 corresponds to my x value, which is 1. My sine corresponds to my y value, which is 0. And my tangent is going to be sine over cosine, so it would be 0 divided by 1, which would be 0. So you can see that just knowing the fact that each of those points on the unit circle is cosine, comma, sine, we can use that information to fill out this whole table. Now we want to determine what quadrants the sine, cosine, and tangent values are positive and negative. So thinking about in my unit circle, remember my first quadrant is here, my second quadrant is here, this one's my third quadrant, and this one is my fourth quadrant. So if I'm thinking about quadrant 1, which is between 0 and pi over 2, well, between 0 and pi over 2, that's quadrant 1. I know that my cosine values are going to be positive. And the reason I know that is because cosine corresponds to my x values. And in the first quadrant, I only have positive x values. I know that my sine values are also going to be positive because in the first quadrant, I have positive y values. And then tangent is always sine over cosine. Well, if I take my sine, which is positive, divided by my cosine, which is positive, I will also get a positive value. Alright, so if I'm going from pi over 2 to pi, well, this is pi over 2, this is pi, so that's going to be my second quadrant. So in the second quadrant, if I think about my cosine values correspond to my x-coordinates, and my x values in quadrant 2 are going to be negative. So that's why my cosine values are negative in quadrant 2. My sine values, those correspond to my y values, and in quadrant 2, my y values are positive. So then, to think about my tangent values, remember my tangent is sine over cosine, so if I take a positive divided by a negative, that's going to give me a negative value. Now going from pi to 3 pi over 2, this is pi, this is 3 pi over 2, so that's going to be my third quadrant. Okay, so in the third quadrant, okay, I think about it and my x values are negative, my y values are negative, so I know that both of those are going to be negative. Then if I think about my tangent, tangent is sine over cosine, a negative divided by a negative gives me a positive. And lastly, 3 pi over 2 to 2 pi, this is 3 pi over 2, this is 2 pi. So that's going to be my fourth quadrant. And in the fourth quadrant, my x values are positive, my y values are negative. So x values are positive, y values are negative. And tangent is sine over cosine, so a negative divided by a positive would give me a negative. All right, and that is everything for section 3.